In 2009, Tsitsi founded and continues to direct the Institute of Creative Arts for Progress in Africa, Trust, in Harare, Zimbabwe, where she's very, very active in that regard. Since 1989, Tsitsi is credited with readings, lectures, seminars, workshops, consultancies, screenings, and addresses in various film disciplines and at various literary and academic conferences and at film festivals. I thought that would be the best way that I could summarize the so many places that she's traveled. She's also currently developing 6 feature films set in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, and Nigeria, including adaptations of 3 novels longlisted for the Etisalan Prize for Literature in 2014 and various other years. We look forward, Tsitsi, to your 4th novel, dystopian young adult speculative fiction titled Tsitsi and the Great Ancestor of Fire. And of course, we do look forward to many, many more creative works to come. May I then introduce the speaker this evening before I set her up even more than that. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much, Edward, for the lovely introduction. Unfortunately, I have to disappoint you a little bit. I started a lot of the things that were very rightly attributed to me, but I didn't finish them. The good news is that I did finish my presentation for today, and I hope I will be able to actually finish presenting it. Okay, and I will go straight into it because there is quite a bit to work through, and I will read, as I would like to make sure that I make sense. First of all, though, I must say how indebted I am to STIAS for the privilege of sharing my thoughts on the Shona subject: who, how, if, and where do we go after all that. As a writer of fiction, I was stunned when STIAS asked me to submit a proposal for this fellowship. I didn't quite know what was wanted, and I was too timid to ask. I thought if I ask, they'll realize I am not an academic. So I didn't ask. I simply completed the application, and here I am. Thank you, STIAS, for being creative in your selection processes. I'm also indebted to all the fellows who have helped me shape my thinking through conversations, their presentations, and reading recommendations. Fellow fellows, I ask for your indulgence. I am about to encroach shamelessly on your disciplines, with no excuse other than that I like to tell a good story. So, is this going to work? Yes. Excellent. So this is how I'll structure the presentation. I'll begin with some sentences that ought to be definitions, but which really aren't. I'll look at who through the lens of migration of early Africans from West Africa, some of whom settled in the land that is now Zimbabwe. I'll look at how, from the perspective of encounters of these migrated populations with groups that came after them. With respect to if, I'll look at how the last of these encounters resulted in a migrant population being called the Shona. I'll be struggling a bit all the way. I am contesting some of the names currently used to refer to some of these populations. However, that means I do not have the names with which to speak and be heard. My solution is often to identify the groupings by actions and locations. So I frequently refer to migrants, former migrants, or erstwhile migrants, or to people who live between such and such rivers. Just a couple of examples. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts on how we might go forward in a better manner than the one which brought us to where we are today. Whoops, going the wrong way here. Yes, there we are. So the first sort of definition is for the word Shona. The word Shona is recognizable to many. In common usage, it refers to the language of a group of people in contemporary Zimbabwe and to the people themselves. Zimbabwe being an area located, as you can see, south of the Zambezi, that's the river in the middle there, stretching down to the Limpopo River, and on the west, bounded by the Kalahari Desert Basin and by the coastal lands of the Indian Ocean in the east. It is the area where the particular group of migrants that I am interested in settled. A lot of the area is plateau, so I may also refer to plateau or plateau dwellers. The other sort of definition is for the word subject. I use subject in the sense of the one who X, Y, or Z, the one who does something, the protagonist, the one who acts. My interest in the idea of the subject dates back to when I was a film student in Berlin in the 1990s. This interest was initiated by an event that took place at the end of a documentary seminar when my cohort presented their documentary films. One member of the group had filmed a Berlin basketball team. The special thing about this basketball team was that one of the players was black. There were not many black people to be seen in the streets of Berlin back then, and even fewer to see in moving images. I was delighted to see this tall, handsome man doing his thing so well on the screen. But just as I was settling down to have a good look, there was a cut and he was gone. This happened again and again. There would be a glimpse of this male person of color. The glimpse was followed by a cut, and then there was no person of color to be seen. I call this the no black body to be seen phenomenon. Feminist film theory is always my first theoretical resort when faced with an issue in praxis. Therefore, I turned to feminist film theory. And excellent. Here, a fundamental proposition of feminist film theory is that on-screen relations between categories in a set of elements that are categorized according to their difference reflect the way in which relationships between the different elements in the category are constructed in society. So the way difference operates on the screen reflects the way difference operates in society. The set of difference investigated by feminists is, of course, gender. Extrapolating feminist film theory to the set of race, the parallel between the cinematic performance of gender for the visual pleasure of the default white male viewer protagonist with the cinematic performance of race for the visual pleasure of the same became very apparent to me. And this explained the removal of the male black body from the student documentary. These relationships are now well researched, but that was not the case at the time in the 1990s. Feminist film theory introduced me to general film theory, so that now my understanding of the subject as protagonist is informed by how film theory engages with ideas of narrative construction and the operation of discourse informing the subject, who is at once historical and contemporary and always social. Whoops, wrong way again. There we go. So, drawing on Broder et al.'s 2016 edition of Sartre's 1961 Rome lecture, What is Subjectivity? By subject, I refer to a complex of actual and potential positionalities within the presently acting historical human psychosoma, that is the mind and body combined as one entity, which motivate specific kinds of context contingent behaviors. The basketball documentary is how my historical interest in the notion of an acting subject arose. My current motivation is the behavior of Zimbabwe's governing party, its supporters and enablers, as well as the behavior of opposition groupings and ordinary Zimbabweans concerning the crisis in the country. I am inquiring through the lens of psychosomatic positioning how members of a nation can allow their nation to sink into the morass that Zimbabwe continues to sink into. I will not go into the Zimbabwean situation, as there is a lot of information on that topic in the public domain, and it would take forever in any case. So now I turn to an overview of the migrations. The great majority of the inhabitants of Zimbabwe today came down into the region in a migration that began 4,500 years ago. I love that number, it's just so huge. 4,500 years ago. The date of onset of this migration varies between 3000 and 2000 BC according to different sources, and so I have taken the average of 2,500, which is also given by some writers now. Excellent. Sorry. Yeah, okay, I'll just let it quieten down. Okay, so there's this lovely map of the migrations with the time periods where the people arrived when. And as we can see, the migration originated in West Central Africa, as I call it, on both sides of a river called the Benue. This area is today the southeast of Nigeria and the northern part of Cameroon. The southward, northeastward, eastward, and westward paths of this migration and the time periods can be seen on the slide. The people, yes, moved slowly. In some cases, they made new settlements when they arrived in unpopulated grasslands. At other times, the migrants merged with peoples they found en route. The migrants had iron weapons and tools, whereas the people they encountered used weapons and tools of stone, still being in the Stone Age. This is to say the migrants had superior tools and superior weaponry. Clashes must have been inevitable. However, their progress appears not to have been bloodthirsty. I have not found an account of expropriatory genocidal aggression. If I find one, I will write and tell STIAS, and they can post it on the website. Historians such as Njoku tell us that original cultural ideas, including elements of religion, philosophical ideologies, and kinship structures, age grades, and secret societies were retained throughout. Just a very little experiment. Who in here today comes from a culture with age grades? Oh, am I the only one? 2 of us, 3 of us. Yes, they are not spoken about so much anymore, but I remember that when I was young, people talked about the zera a lot. And one way of telling a child that a child had to be respected was, do not talk to that person like that. That person is not your zera. You can talk to people in your zera, your age grade, any way you want, but not to people outside it. And so these were the kinds of cultural legacies. And of course, there were influences from the populations they passed through that impacted on the travelers and that account for regional differences. The migrants arrived in the area between the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers about 2,000 years ago. My eyesight, yes, here it says 200 years before Christ. A millennium after their arrival, the migrants began to organize themselves into states. That's a big jump, but please bear with me. It's just that there is a lot to get through. So I'm just going to have a look at how the migrants in the area between the Zambezi and the Limpopo began to organize themselves into states. Yes, there we are. So chronologically, we have the Zimbabwe state, which was established in the 12th century. This is in the Christian era, and there you can see the little star right in the middle. Then we have the Wenemutapa state, which was established in the early 15th century, which is more to the north. We have the Torwa state, founded in the late 15th century, which is down in the southwest. And that is also the location of the Roji state, which was founded in the late 17th century. And the interesting thing is the Mutapa state and the Roji state, and the way that they overlapped in time, although they were centered in quite different parts of the region. But really, the Torwa state began to emerge as the Mutapa state declined, but that decline went on for some time. So that's the historical overview of the migrations, and or prehistorical, if you like. I will have to ask my historian fellows here to help me on that. What constitutes prehistory and what constitutes history? So now I'll move on, equally in overview, to the encounters. Yes. So the migrants reached the central and northern parts of the East African coast. Today's Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, and southern Somalia between 1200 and 500 BC. Very, very slow if we think that they then only crossed the Zambezi around the end of at the beginning of the Christian era. And in this area on the East African coast, They soon saw ships arrive from Arab and Persian lands. Aldous Huxley, writing in 1939, said, about 695, the chiefs of Oman, that is, the Arabian chiefs, defeated in a rebellion against the Caliph, fled to the land of Zinj, that is the land of black people, and settled there. They found many existing Arab settlements along the coast. 695 AD, there were already many settlements along the coast, some of them probably even then 500 or 600 years old. Others have said the East African coast was known to people of Persia and Arabia by the 8th century before Christ. So that interaction really did begin quite early. In the second half of the first millennium AD, 500 AD going on, independent city-states ruled by dynasties of Persian and Arab descent, which were established for long-distance trading, developed along that East African coast. And what happened here is that there was an integration of the two people into what we know today as the Swahili culture along the coast. This is quite an important point for me because I spoke about the migration being a migration where people mingled and took on traces of culture and left traces of culture. Now we have another instance of people arriving and mingling and producing a culture. Those are quite important points. I don't want to belabor them, but I would like you to have them at the back of your mind as I go through. So, coming back down to the area of interest, we can see there a city called Sofala down in the south. This was the southernmost of the Arab-ruled city-states, and it was at the end of the Mwenemutapa state trading route to the Indian Ocean. So although the Mutapa state only had some very small lands in that coastal area, a lot of interaction began through this trade route to Sofala. The people who had migrated from West Central Africa 3,500 years earlier imported commodities such as beads, silk, and cotton, which Arab traders offered in exchange for such products as gold, ivory, and foodstuffs. Human beings were also traded. With time, the Mwenentapans, Swahili, and Arabs established trade inland in the Mwenentapa state, so they moved from the coast and went inland, and they conducted trade at large trade fairs in cities. Historians indicate that a fair usually consisted of one or more walled enclosures made of mud or sun-dried brick. Probably they once had a stockade of wooden posts planted in such a way as to take root. What I found interesting is the development of that trade infrastructure and again the mingling of the peoples, the three cultures now in these trades that were called Theda. Well, came to be called Theda. And this was at the end of the 15th century when the people who had migrated down from Central West Africa saw different ships on the ocean. The people on these new ships were Europeans. They were the Portuguese sailors who had traveled down the African Atlantic coast, making various stops after taking and colonizing the North African city of Koita in 1415. Then, at the turn of the century, some Portuguese sailors succeeded in sailing around the Cape and sailing up the East African coast. Then, That slide shows the trade routes and the exploration routes that the Portuguese used as they arrived on the East African coast. On the East African coast, the former migrants encountered these Portuguese sailors from as far down as the Eastern Cape, because I won't go back to the migration, but we can remember that the migration came down the eastern side and then went up and didn't really get to the Western Cape. So when the Portuguese started their migration, they began to encounter the former migrants in the Eastern Cape. They had encountered the Khoikhoi and the San people in the Western Cape. So this encounter went on from the Eastern Cape as far up as to Malindi, which is in Kenya today. And in Sofala, as well as a couple of other city-states like Kilwa, the Portuguese wrested control from the Arab rulers and occupied it, building forts, etc., in order to maintain their control. As trade was one of their interests, the Portuguese established relations with the Mwenemutapa state and also traveled inland to trade at the fairs in addition to trading on the coast. Arriving later, the Portuguese lived in settlements around the fair, not in those stockades that I mentioned earlier. They lived around it. The Mutapa Beach tells us appointed a captain of the gates in these Portuguese communities to oversee the affairs of the Portuguese. And the captains of the gates were expected to keep in touch with the Mutapa through certain of his wives. However, over the decades, the Mwenemutapa lost control of the affairs to the Portuguese and made treaties with them. The Portuguese used these treaties to make claims to land as late as the 1890s. And I would ask you to remember that date, because this Portuguese presence in the east, in the land between the Zambezi and the Limpopo, is going to become important later on. So now I go on to the last encounter, which occurred around the middle of the 16th century, when Northern European people also sailed down to the South African Cape and established themselves in the western part of it. The first of these Northern Europeans were the Dutch, through the Dutch East India Company. Capitalist pressure from the company, combined with growing numbers, caused the groups of Dutch settlers to move out of the western colony northwards and eastwards. Moving eastwards, of course, they encountered the former migrants again. The former migrants in the Eastern Cape were provoked into wars to counter this invasion of their territory. These early wars with the Dutch consisted of a series of skirmishes, after which it seemed life could go on more or less as normal. But then in 1795, the British annexed the Cape Colony from the Dutch at the request of the Dutch royal family. Yes, this blew my mind as well. You know, I just couldn't understand why would the Dutch royal family be asking the British to annex, but apparently it was to do with a war with France, and the British and the Dutch were obviously in some kind of alliance, and so the Dutch royal family thought that if the British took over the colony, then the French wouldn't get it. So that's what that was all about. And so up until 1793, up until 1795, the first and second frontier wars were with the Dutch. And then there was some back and forth with this area, the Cape Colony, between the British and the Dutch, until it was finally relinquished by the Dutch to the British again in 1806. And so those wars in between that period were kind of mixed wars where the British and the Dutch, and of course some of the people of the area joined forces to push the former migrants out. And then after that, we have the colony being a British colony and the wars being essentially between the British and any of the people that the British could induce to become their allies. So in a further series of wars, the British established what some historians characterize as a militarized rule in the former migrants' Eastern Cape area. These historians say that British rule was masculinist, and there's a wonderful explanation about how the base of society in the former migrant areas in the Eastern Cape was divided between the women who worked the land and the men who went out, for example, with the cattle and to fight, etc. And so by dispossessing people of the land, there was a greater proportionate dispossession of women from their power base, because their power base was actually in the land. And I think that many of us know that even today, in contemporary culture, contemporary society, it is often the women who do the gardening or even in the fields. So that is why they characterize it as masculinist. Obviously, it was militaristic and it was racist. While being these things, however, the British government claimed equality at law of the erstwhile migrants and the autochthonous people of the area, the latter having similarly been driven from their land in the Western Cape. According to one writer, the British success derived from their concentrated brutality and totally alien viciousness. More Amaxhosa were killed than wounded, among them many women and children. Up to 20,000 Amaxhosa were driven out of an area of 4,000 square miles. Now, to assuage a reluctant colonial office in London, however, John Craddock, one of the governors in the Cape area, who was also a military person, who had served in India and in Ireland, wrote that there has not been shed more Kaffir blood than would seem to be necessary to impress on the minds of these savages a proper degree of terror and respect. The former migrants saw 5,000 more British pour into and settle in the lands they had lived in, assisted by the British government. The British program was to transform the erstwhile migrants from hostile natives into friendly customers, as well as to convert them into labor for British production and commerce. Treaties were signed and ignored, apparently by both sides. Banished migrant people were taxed. The migrants even heard calls for their extermination. The word was written on a banner, and the banner was paraded by British subjects in the Eastern Cape. The British newcomers also disrupted life amongst former migrant people on the East Coast. Here, in the early decades of the 1800s, pressures led to upheavals that reinforced violent power struggles amongst the former migrant polities. In 1823, a military specialist broke away from the Zulu kingdom. Moving first northwest, he took his followers with him. This military specialist's name was yes, all together now, Mzilikazi, who was of the Kumalo clan. His soldiers raided and pillaged as they went, often commandeering young men into Mzilikazi's army and young women into concubinage. This is the route that he took, first northwest, and then going further up the continent. Mzilikazi settled in several places on his path from the east, but under attack from Boers in the late 1830s, as the map indicates there where there's the sharp turn, he crossed the Limpopo River as the king of a new warrior nation of Amandebele people. Mzilikazi settled in the west of the area between the Limpopo and Zambezi rivers, where he had ongoing quarrels with other former migrants he found there. After a couple of years, he built his capital called Bulawayo, close to present-day Bulawayo. From this capital, Mzilikazi established tributary dominion over some of the Roji elements he encountered in the area, and he engaged in ongoing contestations for dominion over other Roji who did not accept his supremacy. This is also important. He did manage to establish tributary dominion over some of the Roji, and it is the Roji. Remember, they were down in the southwest, not over the whole area. And others, even in that area, continued to resist. They did not accept his supremacy. This will become relevant later on also. So, back in South Africa, diamonds were discovered in the central regions in 1867, prompting a diamond rush. In 1870, the stones were found in Kimberley. By 1888, a British man had amalgamated the diamond mines at Kimberley and launched the company De Beers Consolidated Mines. He was also the first to put erstwhile migrants who came to the mines to work into enclosed compounds so as to, I quote, isolate men from their sources of liquor, prevent them from deserting, and stop them from smuggling diamonds to illicit buyers. This man was called Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes, in partnership with his friend Charles Rudd, had already founded in 1881 the British South Africa Company. The aims of the British South Africa Company, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica Online, were 1, to extend the railway from Kimberley northward to the Zambezi, 2, to encourage immigration and colonization, 3, to promote trade and commerce, and 4, to secure all mineral rights in return for guarantees of protection and security of rights to the former migrant polities. Now, following an earlier unsuccessful gold rush in the West, European people, predominantly British, driven by the British South Africa Company, wanted to prospect in the land east and northeast of the Ndebele Kingdom. They called this area Shona land. I'll come back to that too. In the year that diamonds were discovered at Kimberley, north of the Limpopo, a son of Mzilikazi, Lobengula, was crowned king of the Amandebele following his father's death. That is 1870. As the Ndebele state had established dominion over a number of northeastern polities, the British found it tactical to treat Lobengula as the monarch of all the lands to the northeast and the east. In 1888, Rhodes sent Charles Rudd with 2 other Britons to obtain a treaty from Lobengula for mineral rights in the northeastern and eastern areas of the plateau between the Zambezi and the Limpopo. This treaty was to enable the British South Africa Company to prospect and mine in those lands with all the rights, as we heard. While the British government professed concern with the well-being of the former migrants in the area, both Rhodes and the British imperial government had a British-only policy, and the Portuguese were still allying with former migrant chieftaincies to press in from the east and northeast. So working with Lobengula was also an anti-Portuguese tactic on the part of the British. After obtaining the required concession from Lobengula, which is now known as the Rudd concession, the following year, in 1889, Rhodes received a royal charter for the British South Africa Company. He then marched through the Ndebele state to Mashonaland with settlers who called themselves the Pioneer Column in 1890. There the company, protected by its own private army, began activities, ruling over the erstwhile migrants they found in the area. The name they gave to these former migrants was the Shona. Lobengula, the king of the erstwhile migrant Amandebele, worked hard to manage the situation, to control his young impis who disliked the increasing intrusion of Europeans into their land, and to retain his authority. However, in 1893, the company manufactured a pretext for war and defeated the Amandebele. In 1895, although the name had been in use before, the company and the settlers who had arrived with the company called the area between the 2 rivers, between the Kalahari Basin and the Indian Ocean coastal lands, Rhodesia. And now here's what I think people call a fun fact these days. The first act of sabotage in the new private company governed state formation was in 1893. In 1915, the British South Africa Company's Royal Charter was extended for a further 10 years. Towards the end of that period, in 1922, the Rhodesians were given the option of joining the Union of South Africa or of being given responsible government by the British imperial authorities. The Rhodesians voted for responsible government. It was granted in 1923. The Rhodesians set up administrative systems. Much of the work of these administrative systems was to dominate and control the former migrants. The officials who carried out this task came to be called native commissioners. So, just some points on how the Rhodesian governments governed in the area they had entered. Excuse me. So in the slide, you can see some of the main features of the Rhodesian system of governments. And there were the alliances with and manipulation of ruling authorities, that is the existing polities, the patriarchal alliances and the exclusion of women, including exclusion of women in the process of codifying the laws by which women and men in the former migrant communities were to be governed. And this is quite important because by only speaking to the men, the points of view of men as to how they would like the society to be were what were then codified into what was called customary law and became known as tradition. So this was another aspect of the British masculinist approach. This set of tactics, the first four, 1 to 4, as you can see on the slide, were first pioneered by a Briton called Shepstone, the son of a missionary in the Cape Colony, who was sent to work in Natal in various capacities. It was to become the model for British colonial government in Africa. Other tactics, such as levying hut taxes, this always is very strange to me. You find people living, you get a treaty from them, you come and see the houses they live in, and you say, pay me tax for your house. Anyway, that's how it works. I don't know whether it's that much different today, but that's how it worked back then. So these other tactics, like the hut tax and coercing labor, had already been implemented by the British South Africa Company. So I've mentioned how the idea of Mashonaland and the idea of tradition codified as customary law was invented by the British settler government. I've also mentioned how they called the people the Shona. Now I turn to the question of if this naming was valid. The former migrants themselves did not refer to either each other or themselves as Shona. The people of specific polities had specific names for themselves, and these names were used by the other groupings also. For example, people in the Makoni area in the east, the middle of the east, are called Wamaungwe. Those around Mutoko are called Wabucha. Those from Wedza are called Waira, and so on. There are all these different names that people recognized each other by and called themselves by. When asked to refer to themselves as a macro grouping, the former migrants said Tiri Vanu, meaning we are people. And the language was referred to as Chivanu. This had been recognized early by British people coming into the area. One of the men who explicitly wrote about this was called Hartman, but was ignored in favor of the category Shona. Historians generally concur that as a group, the first migrants who crossed the Zambezi in the late centuries before Christ called themselves Karanga. The Portuguese corrupted this name into Mokaranga. Perhaps the British anti-Portuguese imperialism is also part of the reason for the British naming all of the people Shona. There is, however, no consensus on where the word Shona came from. Some say it is derived from a derogatory Ndebele language term used to refer to people to the northeast of the Ndebele kingdom. There are other theories, and here is an interesting one from a Zimbabwe government newspaper called the Patriot. As you can see, the 2015 article claims the name is based on Indo-Germanic words meaning beautiful. And German speakers will know that beautiful in German itself is schön. So this idea about the derivation of the word Shona was not presented by the Patriot newspaper. It wasn't the first to present this explanation, but they did present it to the general population, which is very interesting and important because it is these government instruments that are able to reach masses of people in Zimbabwe, whereas the general population is not able to read academic articles nor to participate at public lectures like this. I am all for positive, affirming stories being given to people, but obviously a newspaper like the Patriot does not only give positive, affirming stories. So, at the same time, missionaries also worked to consolidate the Rhodesian settler naming of the people as the Shona. Numbers of Christian missions were set up throughout Rhodesia from early on. Different Christian denominations were headquartered in different parts of the country. The missions produced educational and religious literature in different modes of language with different orthography, depending on the variety of language spoken in their area of operation. This variety of language was an administrative problem for a central government, and also an economic problem for a government that wanted to operate and rule as cheaply as possible. As a result, the Rhodesian government itself requested the missionaries to adopt a standardized orthography. However, this really is amusing. However, the missionaries were all invested in their own orthographies and language varieties. They were unable to agree. Does that sound familiar for that part of the world? So, unable to agree, they ended up asking for professional assistance. Again, déjà vu there. With the missionaries and government collaborating, a grant was secured from the Carnegie Foundation that enabled the appointment in 1929 of Professor Clement Doke, a linguist at the University of the Witwatersrand, as a consultant. Doke's mandate was to achieve, I quote, a settlement of the language problems involving the unification of the dialects into a literary form for official and educational purposes, and the standardization of a uniform orthography for the whole area. A committee of 3 missionaries was appointed to assist Doke, and there are no prizes for saying who is conspicuous by absence. So Doke released his report in 1931, and he made several recommendations for a standardized language. 3 are particularly relevant to my topic. The first is Doke's suggestion for a 32-character alphabet. This 32-character alphabet was to include phonetic symbols for sounds that were not present in English, these being the sounds that had caused considerable variation in orthography. This suggestion was rejected by the English native commissioners. Secondly, Doke grouped the linguistic modes of the many political entities into 6 dialects. These he called Chisezuru, spoken in the center of the country, Chikaranga in the central south, Chimanyika in the east, Chindau in the southeast, Chikorekore in the northeast, and Kalanga in the southwest. None of the other languages apart from Ndebele were considered going forward in the country. And the interesting thing about these 6 dialects is that because missionary work was centered in headquarters that served a large area, also perhaps because of the 3 missionaries on the committee, these dialects corresponded largely to the language groups that had appeared in the missionaries' own work. Thirdly, Doke proposed the name Shona, which had already been in use by the British and Rhodesians for decades for all the 6 languages. On the strength of this recommendation, all the former trans-African migrants in question officially became known as Shona people who speak the Shona language. In an aside, I'd like to point out an interesting thing about the west of the country, that is the Ndebele area. The Rhodesian calls this area Matebele land, although the people refer to themselves as Amandebele. And it sounds like a small difference, but Matebele was the name given to the members of the Kumalo clan as they first broke away from Zululand by the other Nguni clans that they met, meaning the people with the long shields. Ndebele also means long shields from my sources, but the form of the word is how the Ndebele people call themselves, but the British opted for the name that was given, not for the name that the people called themselves. So I think I've been going on for quite a while now. And I hope, yes, I am on track here. So I'm just going to check to make sure I get to show you a clip and not that I've skipped it. Yes, it is coming. So good. So that's the situation that takes us up to the naming of this group of people as the Shona and their languages, the Shona language. So far, I have only engaged with the historical subject. I have not yet looked at the nature of subjectification processes generated in the pre-colonial social fabric and how these subjectifications interacted with the colonial challenge to produce the contemporary subjective profiles that inform action or even inaction in Zimbabwe today, which was my project. But as I began my research here at STIAS, it just began to expand, and so I had to limit it to this historical section. So that is another aspect of my inquiry, STIAS, I hope you're listening, which I anticipate taking up in the future. To close, I share some suggestions for the way forward based on the preceding historical perspective. Some of these suggestions are practical and others are not. I include the impractical ones also as an exercise in imagination. I divide the suggestions into those that apply to the general population of human beings descended from the former migrants, a population estimated to be about 150 million people, and suggestions specific to Zimbabwe. So, beginning with the general suggestions. Firstly, populations of former migrants could adopt a calendar beginning from the migration 4,500 years ago. This means today we would be in year 4,521. This would give each individual a sense of a past and having a history, and thus of joining much of the rest of humanity in temporality. Secondly, populations of former migrants could build a shared recognition of and identification around the migration and its aftermath. This could be done through systems of knowledge production and systems of representation, such as scholarship, education, and the arts. To do so would dismantle the notion of former migrant tribes invented by colonials and subvert processes of tribalism. It would render symbolic goods which have been discredited available as a resource for life today. I had come to a rudimentary understanding of this while I was a film student. On the basis of a shared culture between many sub-Saharan people and in the face of positions that categorize African films as unviewable and therefore not economically viable, I proposed that dramatizing folk tales would result in large populations being engaged by the film, with the result that such films would be economically viable. I tested this by making a short film called Kare Kare Jaco, based on a popular Zimbabwean folk tale. At screenings I attended outside Zimbabwe, from South Africa as far north as Uganda, audiences recognized the film as familiar. People told me they understood certain words of the original, for example, moyo, heart. Others said they had a version of the folk tale in their culture. Here's the trailer to give you an idea of what I mean. Now, how do I actually get this to start on here? Will it start? Oh, I don't think it's going to work. Oh, there we go. But sound. Now I need sound.
Let's see if we can get this.
Oh, there, it should work now. Just
Kare kare zvako rakanga riri gore dzefundo vanhu vese vakanga vaine nzara here vese vese here mai pamusoro imi munogara pachuru chino vana vangu vafa nenzara zvandinazvo zvamungada munouya muchitorawo
Ikoko.
yeah. So that was just. Thank you.
kare kare zvako rakanga riri gore dzefu.
Yeah, so that was just to give you an idea of what the story was about. Anyway, so that's fine. So that's the kind of film that I thought could be useful in developing a cinematic culture that could also be viable while sharing some of these symbolic goods and creating a sense of identification. Now, for the third proposal,
Okay, accommodations.
Yeah, holidays.
Okay. Virginia.
Lovely, thank you very much. So now on to the third general suggestion. I propose more research into the etymology and semiotics of the words from which the term Bantu is derived. As we know, Bantu is a term that has come to be used for both the languages and the peoples of the migration. It is an anglicization of the word for people. I have a hunch the original words might open windows into some aspects of the cosmologies and world views behind the languages. Oh dear. Ah, there we are. Yeah, that's where I want to be. Good. So this is a slide showing possible ways that looking at the word as it appears in the language of my part of Zimbabwe, where the word, if you remember, is Vanhu. Remember, people would say Tiri Vanhu. So Vanhu becomes Bantu, that V and V. Vanhu is people. It is plural. Mu is singular. The singular prefix mu means so much as the one of, the one who is. Wa, the plural, the ones of, the ones who are. So a person could be understood to be the one of Mu, and people are the ones of Mu. On the other hand, a thing is Chi Mu. I flounder here, but I would say this could roughly be approximated by calling it something like an object with a quality of Mu. This Chi denoting an object with a quality of Mu, not Mu, a person, but an object, with things being Ji, Mu, objects with qualities of Mu. Finally, we have the abstract form U, Mu, meaning so much as personhood. I find this a fascinating train of thought, but shan't go into it as this is just conjecture and it might be quite wrong. I'll turn now to the Zimbabwe-specific suggestions. My first Zimbabwe-specific suggestion is to change colonial, provincial, and language names. I've already said something about language. I would only add that the Zimbabwean government has included and continues to include more languages to the list of official languages, which is a good thing. How this plays out in practice, in communication, education, etc., however, is another question. That is to say, the formal action has been done, although there has not been as much intentionality with respect to practice. Concerning provincial names, the government retained the colonial names for the country's provinces, with the exception only of Masvingo province, which formerly was Victoria province. A question is why the government has not engaged more robustly with this legacy. Another question concerns the intention underlying changing only one provincial name, the one that pointed to colonial sovereign power, while those names that connoted the subjected status of the citizens were retained. My second Zimbabwe-specific suggestion is for more scholarship around the loose federal-type relationships that existed between polities historically, to learn whether elements of that system might be modified for beneficial use today. Decentralization is provided for in the Constitution of Zimbabwe, but it is based on notions of federation taken from non-local political practice. And by local, I also mean historically local. We do know that the logic of the liberation struggle, in spite of its socialist rhetoric, was very much guided by local history-informed theory and practice of the time, that is, the 1960s through to the 1980s. And we do know that co-opting these forms of political knowledge and practice were seen as oppositional to repression. However, I think the potential efficacy of such ways of knowing and doing politics was and continues to be subverted by the secrecy of the liberation struggle project and by ZANU-PF's post-independence cultic deployment of these knowledges for partisan rather than for national ends. I think if the way older bases of political formation are deployed in Zimbabwe, in contemporary Zimbabwe, were to be made visible, and if we had more knowledge about these older bases of political formation, we could understand better what is taking place in Zimbabwe today and also how to engage with it. Such inquiry would, of course, produce flattering and unflattering results. Critical engagement with both would be beneficial. Thirdly, I think Doke's 32-character alphabet for the language should be introduced. The native commissioners are no longer present to object. Introducing the alphabet would imbue a sense of own specificity amongst the language users. My contention is that the set of diphones, that is, 2 letters, in use today to denote the phonetic symbols do not, in fact, do so, and represent an accommodation to the Anglo-Saxon linguistic realm instead of being an expression of the erstwhile migrant linguistic realm. I conclude, along with Chimundu, 1992, that it would appear then that for the indigenous Africans, the price of Christianity, Western education, and a new perception of language unity was the creation of regional ethnic identities that were at least potentially antagonistic and open to political manipulation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Tsitsi, for that fascinating historical tour and these very interesting, provocative, perhaps, suggestions that you proposed. I'm sure there will be interesting comments and questions, so they will come from both the room here and from the online audience. And I suggest we start with any questions from the room, and then I'll keep an eye on the online audience for any raised hands online. So let's start. So Louise.
Thank you so much, Tsitsi. It was lovely to listen to you and very rich, so many things that one can think of and respond to. But the question I would most like to pose to you is in response to your point about the masculine dimension of British rule, talking only to the men, codifying customary law that serves the interests of men as tradition. And of course, then there's a big danger that when we start to decolonize our curricula and so on, we will revert back to what has been created as tradition by colonial powers. But from your perspective, also as a feminist, what resources do you think are there in the indigenous cultures still that we can exploit to unearth an alternative gender system, power for women, greater equality or more fluidity around gender categories? What is it that we have lost in the process of masculinizing African societies?
Thank you, Louise. That's really a very important question that I am constantly thinking about. And I think I've touched on this in my fiction. Nervous Conditions has this character of an aunt who is called Tete. And she is described as a kind of female patriarch, not a member of the patriarchy, but the raising of the feminine to power. This is an aunt who is, let me get this right, who is the sister of your father. So this is a particular aunt who has this power status. And so this figure was very powerful. And I think that even those kinds of institutions have been eroded because the wider society does not support it. Another thing that I have discovered as I was doing research for another project on Chuma and Susie, who carried Dr. Livingstone's body down from Zambia to the coast, was the kind of seats of feminine power in traditional structures. This is going to Malawi now. And I read about this before I had started this inquiry, and I was surprised by how going up the continent you could find these seats of feminine power, and where men would actually go to live with their wives. And so I think there is a richness there that we have lost, that was deliberately codified out. And I think research of this kind could find out what this basis is, and see how it can be rehabilitated. You know, I haven't done enough research to give you very definite answers, but I can point to those kinds of things that I have discovered and that I still see that are in the culture. Another thing was that inheritance. A woman who was married would be given her own land, and anything that she produced from that land would in fact belong to her, and she could pass it on to her daughters. So that was another way of ensuring that property was passed on, if not land, but at least some kind of property. Then there were different aspects of the bride price, including at least one beast that would also go to the mother, and it's called the cow of motherhood, Mombe Yomai. So again, this would ensure that a woman had some kind of property resulting from the work that she had done in raising the children. And we know that that kind of thing really was not codified into law. It was customary, so you could do it if you wanted to, but it was open to exploitation. So there is a lot there that I think could be brought back into mind, if not practiced again, but brought back into mind to show that in fact the kind of very toxic patriarchy and masculinities that we see today need not be regarded as traditional and endemic to who we are.
Thank you, Louise. So we don't have any questions online yet, so we'll go on Patrice. Thanks. Please remember to stand
up for my half-baked question. Thank you so much for that. I was really interested in, towards the end, when you were kind of discussing ways forward potentially, and thinking about, in particular, I think it was your reference to the having more research on the loose federations of these migrant groups. So I was wondering how that might also impact on how the people of Zimbabwe today might think about land, the whole issue of land, and rethinking it in a way that can maybe resist the whole sort of logic of the nation state, those sorts of questions. And I'm just also interested in the religious, spiritual side and significance of land.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
You know, that is really one of the key issues, because I was talking about the ways in which women were removed from their base in the land. The important thing is that the land was not owned. It was occupied. It was a gift upon which people could live and through which they could support themselves. But nobody from those cultures would actually say, I own this land, it is mine, and you may not. And it was because of that philosophy that it was so easy to mix with other people on new lands, and also to welcome other people onto your land. And so now we are in a capitalist framework of actual private ownership of land. It becomes very difficult. What I do know is that these boundaries were not tribalistic, as is said in the colonial literature. Yes, you would have a central family, a central clan, but then it would umbrella out from there and include many different people. And people could come and go. You would go to the chief, you would say you have arrived and ask for somewhere to live, and you would be given this land. So now I wonder, when we think of parties, which to me seem to be the new polities actually, that people run to for sustenance, for community, in terms of power structure. I'm thinking that if we could understand that, maybe we need not understand party as some kind of private ownership of power, you know, which is what one tends to see in the kinds of dictatorships and hegemonies that are in Zimbabwe and other places. So it would be, again, a long task of introducing different ideas into the imagination. But I do think that if we could have these more diverse conversations and introduce more diverse discourses into people's thinking, then perhaps that could enable us to shift the way we are engaging with power at the moment. You know, I don't know, I don't see that it's practical to think of going back to communal ownership of the land, and even that has been exploited. Because under the colonial system, people were told, okay, now go to the reserves, that is where you can continue with your communal ownership of the land. But other aspects of capitalism, such as the hut taxes, were introduced. And the things that are happening in the communal areas in Zimbabwe today are really quite heartbreaking, where the communal areas are really just like a reservoir for power, for votes. So I think if we can think of power as being more permeable, the way those polities were more permeable, that might give us a different way forward.
Thanks, Patrice. We have several questions online. I'll go to Yana Makua first, and then two others after her. We have another 10 minutes or so, I think, so that gives us enough time to go through a few more. So Yana, first up, please.
Hi, thank you so much, and thanks, Tsitsi, for this wonderful talk. I'm curious to hear a bit more about the linguistic parts of your research, if you know, if there was any kind of discovery there, and particularly, I was wondering if you personally felt that Doke's, what you saw in Doke's studies seemed structurally not to fit the language. I was curious particularly about the way that you kind of offered an alternative reading of Vanu, Munu, etc. And I was wondering if there were other kinds of systematic logics from the Wits linguistics angle that seemed not well suited to the Bantu languages.
Yeah, Jana, thank you for bringing me to think about those aspects of this issue. You know, there are theories of the development of the subject, as they say, that talk to how the subject is developed through language. And so language really is formative. Language really is constitutive. So now, if you think of a missionary arriving in an area where on the boundaries of this issue, people speak in this manner, and on the other side of the boundary, people speak in a different manner, but because I am the missionary and I have to write, I am now going to write in one language, one orthography, and this is what you all have to now conform to. One can see that something is already happening. What happens to those people who did not grow up talking like that? And I mean, this goes on now, where because of the Shona dialect, people who do not speak any of those so-called Shona languages still have to go to school and learn in Shona. This is children who will then go home and speak a different language to their parents. And even where the law does provide for mother tongue education, often it doesn't happen. You know, teachers are overworked and underpaid, and the resources are just not available because they haven't been made available. So I think it is a very significant issue. And to be honest, as someone who speaks this majority Northeastern language, when I did my film work, like doing documentaries on ivory up in the Northwest or going down into the Low Vale, down in the Southeast, I could see practically how this impedes upon people. You have, for example, somebody who speaks Nambia, who knows that I have to go and speak in Ndebele, or I have to go and speak in Chishona, and you're trembling because your field has just been trampled by elephants. So I think it really is very important. And I think the fact that these 6 dialects were taken, first of all, to constitute one language group, is really a matter of colonial expediency, because they needed to be able to administer. And I don't think it really spoke to what was on the ground. And that is my problem. That what we see today was not a result of expression of what was, but the need and the desire of an incoming entity.
Okay, thank you, Jana. Next question from the audience online is from Mr. Dubé, please. Okay, he might be having trouble getting his microphone unmuted or the camera. So let's go to the next question online, which is from Tamar Gab.
Hi, thank you. And thank you. I learned so much, Tsitsi, from that narrative and from that historical trajectory that you outlined from us. I wanted to stretch you, though, to ask how you think about the subject of your literary fiction in relation to these kinds of historical narratives. Because one of the things that's so powerful about the way you write in your fiction is how complex and flawed and three-dimensional your characters are. So they don't come to stand for particular polemics or positions. They are subject to, as you said yourself, historical and other forces, and that helps to constitute who they are as people, as credible people. So having done this interesting research on the migrations and on these language groups and on the colonial construction of Shona as a kind of imposed language system, do you feel that this will inform a kind of literary subject? And how does this kind of historical knowledge find its way into your construction of a literary subject or a character in fiction?
Thank you, Tamar. Yes, absolutely. All the knowledges I gain in whatever way possible eventually find some kind of expression in my fiction. And certainly, I think this will find expression in that it gives me an explanation for why people behave the way they do, but it also gives me a vision as to why it should not continue like that, or rather it does not have to be like that. We can look at the way things are in a different way. And so I think my fiction in the future will go in the direction at looking at how we can see ourselves as part of something bigger. That means that we would not always be at loggerheads with each other, conceiving of ourselves as these very small, vulnerable entities that have been called tribes. At the moment, I'm writing this dystopian young adult fiction, as Edward said in the beginning. It's speculative, and indeed some of the ideas of the cosmology that I have read about and that I will continue to read about in the next couple of months that I'm here will inform that. And what I do generally is when I feel that I am exhausted creatively, that's when I go to garner more knowledge to fuel that creative process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar. Are there any questions from the room? There are more online, but I'd like to make sure we're not missing. Okay, Marcella, please.
Yeah, thank you a lot, Tsitsi. It was great. It made me think about many disparate things, but I try to focus on one aspect. It seems to me that a step back has to be taken, and the thing of the cosmologies and the folk tales is very interesting. I was wondering if concerning language itself, it could be interesting to go into more undifferentiated expressions like vocalization or rhythm, this kind of patterns that might have a broader perspective. And I don't know, I think the voice claims the words. So maybe try to, what do you think about?
Absolutely, Marcella. And one can even go beyond voice into other signs, bodily signs. And I'll just tell you an anecdote. One of my dear friends in Berlin was from Jamaica. And one day he was talking and he said, and that was that. And my eyes just popped and I said, hey, where did you learn to do that? And he said, oh no, we do this all the time at home in Jamaica. So very definitely. And in fact, Njoku talks about the masquerade as being one of the cultural traditions that has expanded because, of course, with the slave trade, these traditions have also been exported across oceans. So absolutely. And, in African American vocalization, this is now becoming SMH, sucking the teeth, as they call it. So very definitely. And that really is much broader than I can go. But I hope that there are people who have the interest and who would do that kind of research.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcella. So let's have one final question, and that will be online from Bodil Volker Fredriksson.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks a lot for a wonderful historical narrative. I was especially interested in what you said about the secret history of the liberation struggle. You seem to say that there is, secrecy surrounding that period, which of course is not strange, And you also said that at the moment it's the party who is benefiting, who is exploiting that history. And then you suggested that it might, I mean, actually this history belongs to the whole nation of Zimbabwe, and that it's very important that access is being given to the broader public into this history. So I'm just wondering what kind of actors, what kind of doers do you see being able to do that? And of course, obviously, I mean, a person like yourself who can write fiction, also who's also interested in sort of the real history would be an obvious person. But do you see other writers, other actors, historians who are doing something in this area, which I think is absolutely very interesting and important?
Thank you very much for that question, which I perceive as very necessary. When I have read most of the work that is being done at the moment, it tends to be by political scientists. They are coming away from a pure political scientist approach, but we are very much in that mode. And the Zimbabwean constitution itself says that Zimbabwe dates from the first war against the British in 1896-97, around then. So there is not a desire to look further back, which I find strange when you think about Zimbabwe having been named after this 12th century state. So I think we are still very much in those modern modes of thinking. I think we need to get out of it. Yes, I think we need, as I mentioned, to have a lot of products of the imagination and knowledge products. The thing is, these products have to be funded. And I know that it is so difficult for people who are interested in this area to go and say, look, this is what I want to do, whether it's creative writing fiction, whether it's creative non-fiction, whether it's academic research, whether it's filmmaking, to go and say, this is what I want to do, please give me money to do it. And this is why we find that a lot of the research tends to uphold the status quo, even when it is criticizing the status quo. The disappearing point is the origin of the status quo. And that is what I think people like myself and the societies that I come from need to shift.
Well, thank you very much for ending on that note. I think we'll put our trust in you, Tsitsi, to do that important work for all of our sakes. Thank you for leading us on this really captivating talk and reflection on the work that you're currently engaged with. So let's have a final applause. You explained to us about personhood, UNU. I'm sure an important element of that is gathering around food and drink. And so for those who are here, I have the pleasure of inviting you to share a glass of something and something to eat. For those who are online, thank you so much for joining us. Our next lecture is on the 13th of May. We look forward to seeing everyone and welcoming everyone back then. Thank you, go well, and goodbye.